Hello, my name is Carla Bowman. I'm the Adult Services Manager at the Euclid Public Library, and I want to welcome everyone to tonight's program. This virtual author visit with Connie Schultz is sponsored by the Euclid Library Foundation. EPL's foundation is an endowment fund established to support and enhance the services, activities, and facilities of the Euclid Library. They regularly sponsor library programs such as author visits and children's literacy programs. For more information about the foundation and for a schedule of upcoming virtual programs, visit the library's website at euclidlibrary.org. Through the support of our foundation, we've purchased 5 copies of Daughters of Erietown, you can see it behind me, as giveaways for early registration for tonight's programs. I've pulled the names and winners, I've pulled the winners' names, and I will email the lucky winners after tonight's program. Now it is my very great pleasure to introduce author and journalist Connie Schultz. Clevelanders know Connie Schultz as a columnist for the Plain Dealer from 1993 to 2011. Known for bringing working class issues to audiences' attention and giving a voice to the impoverished, Connie won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2005. She's a professional in residence at Kent State University, and she continues to publish as a syndicated columnist for Creator Syndicate. Connie is the author of 2 nonfiction books, and most recently, her first work of fiction, Daughters of Erietown. I have a few questions for Connie. Anyone in the audience is welcome to ask questions by typing those into the chat there, and we'll answer those as we go. So Connie, welcome to the Euclid Public Library. We're absolutely delighted to have you here with us this evening.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, so thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I thought we would start off, I'm sure many people who are with us tonight have read your book, but if you could start off by talking about the story. I do want to mention that it received very positive reviews from the Washington Post, the New York Journal of Books, and Publishers Weekly, and Kirkus Review, and they are very critical. They called it a masterful debut, so it's gotten very wide acclaim. If you can just tell everyone here tonight about the story of the Daughters of Erietown.
Well, it spans several decades in the life of the McGinty family, and it is a story primarily, I would argue, of women in this working class town. It's not coincidental that I grew up in Ashtabula, a working class town on Lake Erie, and Erietown is a working class town on Lake Erie. My editor, Kate Medina at Random House, gave me very good advice from the very beginning. She said, look, you can make it as much like Ashtabula as you want, but don't call it Ashtabula because everybody will tell you what you got wrong. And so she was right. I got to include the parts I wanted to of my hometown. I got to change the town in the ways that I wanted to. And it follows the trajectory of these working class lives. And I've often been asked, why write about the working class? And well, first of all, that's where I come from. These are the people I know. I was the first in my family to go to college, as was Sam McGinty in the book. But also, Kate Medina, many years ago, my editor said to me, she made her pitch before I'd ever thought about writing it. She said, the working class is really underrepresented in modern literature. And she thought I could do something about it. It took me a lot longer to believe I could. And when we're talking about working class people, we're not just talking about white people, of course. That's true in regular conversation, certainly true of the book. And the issue of race bubbles up inevitably between Sam, and particularly, and her father, Brick McGinty.
So you've written many columns and 2 nonfiction books, but this is your first novel. And I was wondering, is fiction writing new for you? And I know a lot of, like, did you dabble in fiction writing in college or as? No, okay.
No, I really didn't. I mean, I went to college. First of all, my dad made it very clear that you better have a career when you're ready. When you graduate from college, there better be something you plan on doing with your life. And once I started working for the Daily Kent Stater at Kent State, journalism was all I ever wanted to do. I couldn't believe that I could ask whatever I wanted of people. It was a passport into a world I would otherwise never have been invited into. Certainly by the time I became a columnist, you do have your issues that you keep revisiting. And for me, race was one, certainly gender. and all the issues around gender, and certainly about workers, women and men, and what that life is like. So it's very different writing fiction, though. In one way, it can be complicated for you if you're used to being able to, when I'm looking at a story or a column and I don't have what I need yet, I can pick up the phone, I can send an email. It doesn't work that way. All the characters are in your head, but it's also liberating once you realize they can be whoever you want them to be. And while I always tell my students, as you know, I'm a professional resident at Kent State in the journalism school, and I tell them, don't say someone thinks something or believes something. You could say they think or believe it, but we don't really know what they believe. Well, in fiction, I know exactly what's on everyone's minds. and I really enjoyed that part of it a lot. Very freeing.
Did it take you a long time to write the book?
Yes. Wait, as my editor and my agent would both say, too long. I'm working on one now. I don't intend for it to take a decade, but part of it was simply, this is the only sports analogy I ever use, but writing is like the batter at the plate. It's a head game. And what you tell yourself about yourself really informs your work. And it also can impede you if you don't really see yourself as the writer you're trying to be. And I had spent decades as a journalist, and it took me a bit longer to grow the confidence that at least I could give it the best try I had at fiction writing, and let's see where it lands. So it took me a while to get there. As I said, I'm working on my next novel, and I at least understand that perhaps I can tell a story, right? And I think I have another one in me.
And so this one is historical fiction. Did it require any sort of research from you?
Oh, it did. But,
Okay.
and I didn't set out to write an historical novel at first.
Okay.
I'll never forget one of my friends, Karen Sandstrom, the former book editor at the Plain Dealer. She read it in Galley, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that you had decided to undertake an epic story like this." And it was the first time I'd ever heard the word applied to it. And I said, it just kind of happened. But my research was more, you think you know an era because you lived through it. I mean, I was born in the 50s, went through it, but you can know the facts of history somewhat, but I pretty quickly caught on, like the copy editor would say, well, that would be great if they were dancing to that song, except it didn't come out until December, and you have them dancing in the kitchen in March. So one of the things I did pretty early on, because my editor, Kate Medina, would recommend that I put a few more historical references in it, just to give people, the readers, a sense of place and time. So, those old pamphlets, I don't think they even make them. If you were born, when you were born in 1957.
Yes, I've seen those. Yes.
I have them for every year from born in, let's see, was it 41 through 96? And I found them on eBay, Amazon, Etsy. I got them wherever I could, because it gave me some popular references. Our Bodies, Ourselves has a significant role in the book. That I actually used my copy. I had one of the original copies of it. It was not bought by my mother by any stretch. Ellie's a little more evolved than Mom was on that. I don't know if you can see, but I have a blue train case here under there. That's the blue train case that I used for the model in the book. Once I realized it was going to have a bigger life than just that one scene where Aunt Nessa gives it to Ellie, I needed to find a train case from the 1950s. I needed to feel it, smell it. I needed to see how heavy it was, what it could hold. And I found this on Etsy. So, and then there's one other instance where it was just serendipity. Right after I had talked to my editor and she had talked about adding some more historical references, a dear friend who now lives in Montana, Ann Hansen, sent me 2 Life magazines that she thought I might be interested in. And they were the Life magazines about John Glenn's orbit, and the other story that was that lengthy story about Annie Glenn. Annie and John were both very dear friends to Sharon and me. John had already died at that point. Annie was living, but quite sick. And I thought, you know what? It's the only Valentine I'm going to include in this. I'm going to include a segment of that publication. And Ellie's going to talk about how Annie was as brave as John, and that she was a hero in her own right, but we never talk about that. And it just worked out perfectly because I had the actual publication in my hands.
You mentioned the social, one of the reader questions that was sent in is related to what you were just talking about. She says, from beginning to end, you successfully wove in the social climate and issues of the times. captured local impressions, and even integrated things like the makeup mirror with the day and night settings. And that stood out to me as well. Is there anything of this nature that you wanted to include but left out of the book?
I mean, well, let me put it this way. I wish that it had occurred to me to look up the average length of a novel. I mean, I've read them all my adult life, but it's I turned in 197,000 words. And Kate Medina said, okay, so the average length of a novel is 110,000. We got me down to 124,000. So I had to cut a lot, period. I don't know how many of those kind of references. I mean, many of those references came from memory. Like my mom had that makeup mirror. And my mom was 4'11". And my mom, I have her her nurse's aide badge over my computer here. I made her Ellie a nurse's aide and Brick a utility worker because those were the professions of my parents and they were the working class jobs I knew best. So much of it was organic, I guess. It just, it was, it's my roots. It's so much a part of who I am that it felt, in those ways, I was at ease having these references because they felt familiar. The women's room, I remember giving it to my mother and it made her so angry to read it. So it was that memory of that I thought, that's a touchstone for a lot of women in my generation, having read that book. And I thought I would include it. I wanted to include other female authors.
Mm-hmm.
There's a theme here going on, right? There's Annie Glenn, who's also a hero. There's the French, why am I forgetting her first name, who wrote The Women's Room. I was trying to incorporate other figures from history who were women, because, I mean, it's no secret to anybody who knows my work at all. I have a lot of faith in women. I am very interested in the stories of women, and I wish more women were telling their own stories. And the older I get and the longer I've been in this profession, the more committed I am to that.
Yes. And it came across very strongly in the story. It's very much a women's story. And it explores the role of women in the mid 20th century. We have Ada, the grandmother, who is a mother and a homemaker, takes in Ellie. And then it goes all the way to her granddaughter, Samantha, who goes to college and wants a career and is able to actually accomplish that. Whereas Ellie wasn't able to realize her dreams, at least then. Do you think things are better for women today?
I think things are different for women in some ways. I wish they were, I've said this so many times to younger women in probably the last decade, that my generation thought it would be a lot better than it is right now in some ways. Certainly, we have more women's voices out there and younger women's voices, which is so encouraging. But the obstacles that women still face, and quite frankly, there's also that obstacle between our own ears, that we can be self-limiting because of how we were raised. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's one thing to be my age, 63, and having grown up in New York, and being my age and having grown up in the Midwest, for example. We were playing catch up a lot culturally. And so, but I'm optimistic. I mean, I have heard from so many women since this book came out, and they are sharing their stories. And I love it. So often I was interviewed by younger women when the book was first coming out, and they would tell me that reading it had them wondering about their own mothers and their grandmothers, and they were talking to them and asking questions. And that meant so much to me, particularly because it wasn't just white young women. I love that they could see in their threads of stories that if they hadn't heard them from the women in their lives, they suspected that maybe there was a story to be told. And so they were asking them, you can't ask for more than that as a writer.
Yes, to affect someone like that would be very moving. We have a question here from the audience that I think I'll read here. I thought you did a great job of showing how someone who was abused routinely as a child, Brick, struggled throughout his life with boundaries and understanding limits. How much research did you have to do on the effects of abuse?
Well, unfortunately, I knew it at a very young age. What I didn't know is a man who decided, a father who would decide that it was going to stop with him. I originally had Brick more violent in the book, and my editor said, I understand doing this, but readers are going to hate him pretty quickly. And I think he could be more complicated than that. I ended up agreeing with her, but I said, yes, but we must have a couple of moments where he has to consciously rein himself in. He comes close and he has to remind himself, or Ellie has to remind him that you said you weren't going to be this person, because I've covered issues of domestic violence for decades. And most women, we either have been victims or we know someone who has, and we know how cyclical it is, unless there is a real conscious attempt to stop it. And I didn't want to treat it as something he could just flip off. I wanted to show the struggle of that. So thank you. That I worked really, when I first turned in the book, Kate Medina said to me that Brick was the most realized character in the first draft. When you think it's called the Daughters of Erietown, but I think it was because I was so nervous about writing a man and I wanted to show the complexity of him that I spent more time on him initially. And then I got back into the weeds on the other characters, particularly Ellie. We made her, so I remember saying, could we please have her be less pathetic? Must she be so whiny at such a young age? And that was such a wake up call for me, because that is not what I intended for Ellie at all. And it really helped me find Ellie. It just took a while. And then all of a sudden there she was, and she had a lot on her mind, and she was becoming more opinionated as she went, which I hope for all women, quite frankly.
Yeah. So I did have some sympathy for Brick as I was reading the book. And I felt that he had some, and I understand he was not he wasn't always a great father or a great husband, obviously, but I did have a lot of sympathy for him. We have a question here from the audience. Was it your intention, nonetheless, to embed narcissistic tendencies in Brick's character?
I guess I don't see him as narcissistic. I see him as damaged.
Yes.
I see him as angry at the world for his plight, rather than seeing how he could have taken the reins of his life. He felt like a victim pretty early, and it was hard for him to shake that. Because he does love Ellie. As much as he screws up, he loves her. And he's certainly, Sam is a real challenge to him, particularly on the issue of race. And we see him evolving towards the end because he loves his daughter more than he cherishes his racism. But it's a challenge, and I always wanted to show the tension there.
Yeah, I thought he was a really well-developed character.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Another question from a reader that emailed me earlier. In the novel, several characters keep secrets at different times. What advice would you give to someone struggling with the decision to admit the truth or keep a secret?
Oh, don't we all have our secrets? Most of us have some secrets, right? Yeah. The longer I worked on the book, the more I kept reminding myself that we're only as strong as our biggest secret, right? But most of us are better than our worst mistake. And I tried to weave those in and out. And I think if your secret, and I especially feel this way after so many years of interviewing people whose secrets got the best of them for sometimes a very long time, and how released they felt when they could finally be more open. Because part of the problem is when we keep it to ourselves, it becomes bigger than it is often. And it can define our lives for us. And it can be based on misperceptions often. We may not even be right. How often have we, I love when people tell me stories that they finally, years later, apologize to someone and the person says, I have no memory of you even doing that, right? But it just haunts this person until they finally can shed it. So I understand that, look, I would never say you have, my life is not an open book either. Many think they know everything about my life, but they know what I want them to know mostly. And I am open, more open than some, I understand that. And part of the reason I'm open is I've been a columnist for almost 20 years. And so I got a lot of tread on me here, and I'm used to the attacks and the criticism. So it's easier for me to say, well, you know what? You are who you are. Where is it? I found this the other day. I don't know if this shows up. This is up.
Yes.
Okay. I drew this in college. It was a requirement in graphics class. And it's an image of me at a typewriter trying to meet a deadline. But on it, I'm 21 and I'm writing this quote from Abigail McCarthy, who was married to Eugene McCarthy. And as it turns out, Senator McCarthy, who was a presidential candidate, she wrote a memoir that I finally tracked down and just got in the mail the other day. But she wrote this: I look the way I do, I'm the age I am, and I'm going to do the things I have to do. And I don't know what I was thinking in my 26th step. I was pretty insecure for a lot of reasons. I now have new reasons to be insecure, but it's such an important thing to remember. You know, we can keep waiting until something else happens before we're going to be our authentic selves, or we can just decide, this is it, this is who I am, and I'm not going to waste any more time.
It's just as true today as it was then.
I'm afraid it is.
For everyone. We have a couple comments from the audience. Can you speak more on how the experience of our grandparents, parents, or generations before us shape who we are and who we become? Specifically, how this relates to Ellie and Sam.
Well, that's at the heart of the novel, and it's the heart of our lives, I think. I am often finding myself now saying in interviews that our roots are our beginnings, but they're not our excuses. And in that way, I'm thinking often of Brick. But with Ellie and Sam, Sam is what so many of us who were the first in our families to go to college were. She's going to straddle two worlds for the rest of her life, or anyone who comes from the working class but then goes to college. And I wanted to show that tension of that, because you don't want to forget where you came from, but you inevitably must leave some of that behind if you're going to pursue the world that opens up for you, because you get these new experiences. And I think Ellie struggled with it in her own way with Sam more in some ways, but perhaps it was because they're the same gender. It's a mother-daughter thing. Rick was more willing to let it go with Sam, but he was not great with his son, Riley. And he considered it and I could certainly have seen my father this way, that it was an ultimate failure that his son was carrying a lunch pail to work. Even though for Riley, like so many, college wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't his dream. It was his father's dream, not his own. And I wanted to show that. I mean, look, I've got students who are first generation college kids, and in a couple instances, their parents aren't even talking to them because they wanted to go to college. I mean, there's a lot of, and others more, it's more typical of the experience. They want them to go to college, but they don't really have any idea how to prepare them for college. And so we work hard to keep them there because, you know, you can get if you're in your sophomore year and it's getting tough, it's just as likely a parent could say, well, maybe that's not for you then. Maybe you ought to come home, because they don't know that sophomore year is typically more challenging. And I don't mean this at all in a demeaning way. I mean, I hope it's clear. I have a lot of respect for the people of my roots. Not the racists, but they're not all racist. I know that. And I wanted to show that with Sam, how that can happen. Like me, Sam goes to elementary school in Erietown. Half of her classmates are Black. That is identical to my education in Ashtabula, which it's always interesting how the farther you get away from Ohio, the more people are surprised to hear that about a little town like Ashtabula. But it's not that uncommon in small towns. We were on the lake, so there were a lot of workers. There was shipping, there were factories and plants, right? And a lot of African Americans were coming from rural areas as well. And for them, Ashtabula, or in the novel Erietown, was the step up because it felt more urbane than the country did. And like Ashtabula County, you know, Erietown our county lost 26 boys in the Vietnam War. And there was no way I wasn't going to include the Vietnam War, because we always know who serves in these wars, right? It's the working class, it's people of color. And I wanted to show the impact of that too.
Yeah. And then between Ellie and Sam sort of realized Ellie's dream in a way.
Yeah.
Because she was able to go to college.
She did. I changed the ending. I had various ideas for the ending. And I finally ended up landing on, I wanted Ellie to have, I wanted us to believe that something bigger could be there for Ellie, that it wasn't over for her in her early 60s. And, but I didn't want to make too big of a thing of it. We really don't know yet what that's going to look like for her. But I wanted it to be clear that even though she didn't get the life her daughter got, her life's not over yet. And I see that someone said, thank you for the line, don't be late for your own life. You know, I think, I did not consciously, wasn't aware of this, but I think that came from a Mary Chapin Carpenter song in my head for so many years. And I just kept thinking about how important it is not to be late for your own life, that there are these opportunities. And, if you're never scared, you're not growing, right? I tell my students that. I told my kids that all the time. And now I tell my students, well, I had to apply it to me because it was really scary to put a novel out in the world. And I thought, well, I must be having one hell of a growth spurt because I'm scared out of my mind that this is coming out.
Well, it turned out great.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another comment. Can you talk more about the character of Rosemary and the contrast between her and Ellie? I wondered a lot about her and the fact that we see so much of her life story.
Well, thanks for asking about Rosemary. Boy, the readers are really divided on two characters, Brick and Rosemary, right? In part because of Brick and Rosemary. But I wanted to introduce readers to Rosemary first as this kid who also had to leave to see what she could become. And I wanted them to care about her, at least some, so that she wasn't just the other woman. Because as much as we like to demonize anybody who would get in the middle of a marriage, right? And I'm not trying to justify it all with Rosemary, but I wanted readers to see how complicated she was as well. And, she made very bad choices, especially towards the end, but she was really not seeing herself clearly at that point. She was, the life she had imagined for herself, she had hitched to a man who she could never be with. And I wanted to show what that looks like. And look, I've interviewed too many women over the years who've had children with men who could not be with them. And I've interviewed many of those children as grown children and what it meant for their lives. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit in the novel.
Yeah. And that was a tragedy in a way for Brick as well, that he couldn't be with his son, or felt that he couldn't be a father to Rosemary's son.
Right. And what he didn't know is how much Ellie knew all along. My editor said that knocked her out when she got towards the end of the book. And here it turns out that Ellie had known long before Rosemary showed up at their house because of the encounter she had with her at the department store. And she had noticed her. But, we talk about secrets. Ellie, some women are very critical of Ellie for staying with Brick. I don't see Ellie ever thinking she could have made it on her own. I like when women get angry at that, because I hope that means that they feel more empowered than Ellie did at that time. But Ellie was a person of that time and place, a woman of that time and place, and in a small town in the Midwest. And it was the expectations and the limitations imposed of women were so much greater, I think, even in that era, when you're talking about small towns like that.
We have a comment. What a beautiful message for a daughter to inspire their mother to not be late for her life. It's a very nice.
Thank you.
So we sort of touched on this, but we had a question from a reader this afternoon I would like to share. The question has to do with the autobiographical nature of the book. He says, you open the book with a quote from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn about the difference between a story and a lie. In the Daughters of Erietown, you appear to be telling your family's story like you thought it should or could have been. Harking back to the quote. The reader notes that the book is a lovely, fleshed out version of chapter 6 of your book and his lovely wife. So the question is, what parts are autobiographical, and did you have any concerns that readers would mistake the autobiographical nature of the book as it touches on some difficult family topics?
Well, sure. I mean, I said to my editor early on, I'm just worried that people are going to think this is a story about my family. And she said, they're going to think that anyway. They're going to think what they want to think. She says, they're going to do that with every novel you write. And so just write the novel. And that really freed me up. I mean, certainly this novel, probably more than any novel I'll write, had elements of my upbringing, but they're very different in many, many ways. But, May Sarton, the late memoirist, she published a number of her journals, which I loved, and she was a poet. She once said, and I'm paraphrasing, that perhaps only in fiction can we be completely honest. And I have often thought, well, if that's the case, this is the truest story I've ever told. But certainly, and I've alluded to this a little bit already in this interview, Ellie she is what I had hoped for my mother. My mom, I've already outlived the age of my mother when she died. My mom died at 62. And I certainly in Ellie, without even realizing it at times. And then I really, once my daughter read it, we talked about it, but I said, yeah, this is what I would have hoped. And Brick is certainly a gentler version of what I grew up with. You know, I love my father, but he was a very complicated man and an often violent man when I was young. But I got, you know, they break away from you after a point. I think somebody was asking in the comments, do the characters surprise you? Yes, they really do, because they, and it sounds so weird, I know, to say that, but they take over after a while. And Sharon tells this story of coming home one day, and I looked so sad. I was in the final revisions of my first draft. And he said, what's the matter? And I said, oh, Rick died today. And he said, well, you knew he was going to die. You're the one who wrote him. And I said, I know, but I've been with him for 7 years now, and I'm going to miss him. And that happens. You know, I did not know at the time when I first started writing. I didn't really know that was going to happen. And another Sharon story, I was in the garden. This was deep in the writing of the first draft. And all of a sudden I just said, oh, you're right. Ellie would never do that. She would never have done that. And I go walking, and he's coming behind me, and he said, who are you talking to? And I said, oh, I'm just thinking that I have her doing something. She would never do this. Or if she is going to do this, I got to set this up differently. And I ran into the house to write down some notes so I don't forget it, right? Because I have a hard and fast rule for myself. I write in the morning. I light one of these, for the writers who are listening, this little tea light. I light one of these, and I try to keep myself writing until the flame goes out, which is between 3 and 4 hours. I get up, you know, usually nobody should sit for 3 or 4 hours straight, but I get up, throw in a load of clothes, get back to the writing, that kind of thing. But in the afternoons, I do other things. And of course, because I'm teaching, I'm also grading, and, you know, I'm teaching. But your mind keeps working for you. You get that first draft out, or you get the pages for that day. And then the mind will keep working for you as long as you're distracted. I mean, it really does work like that. That's why I always have a notepad next to my, on the table by my bedside, because so often I'll wake up and there it is. I all of a sudden realize what needs to happen, or occasionally a new character. I think, well, that could work. I mean, there are a lot of characters in this book, but they had to matter. They had to show up for a reason, right? And that's all a process that comes about if you give it time. So while they started with the seeds of, some of them, people I knew, they became somebody very different by the end of the book.
You talk about them as if they're real people. So were you sad when you finished the book?
Yeah, you know, so my editor called me this weekend, and she said, I swear to you, Brick McGinty's in my backyard. Sometimes he's got his hooks in me. And she said, and Ellie, and I think about Ellie, and is she calling to him in the yard? Which, you know, every writer wants to hear this. But I remember my agent calling one point when she was reading the first draft. She said, I am so angry at Brick right now. Every time I think he's going to get better, he screws it up again. So yeah, they do become, they have to, if they're not real to me at some point, how could I possibly ask readers to think of them as real? Mm-hmm. And a lot of writers will tell you when they're done writing, the characters are gone, they're done with them. I don't feel that way about them, but it may be partly because it took so long to write it. They were with me for such a long time, right? So that could be part of it. And also, I mean, the book's in its 5th printing, which I feel really lucky about. Oh. And now the paperback's coming out in June, and I'll be talking about them again. And we're already starting to set up some stuff. And so I guess they're just going to hang out with me for a while.
I'm sure they'll hang out and stick with any of your readers too.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I hope so.
When did you first know you wanted to be a writer?
Oh, well, when I was in high school at Ashtabula High School, my mom was like Ellie, had wanted to become a nurse, never went. So she was hoping that one of her 3 daughters would become a nurse. And I'm the oldest, you know, hopes and dreams. There's Connie, there she goes. But I just couldn't see it. I mean, I didn't have the stomach for nursing. And I thought, okay. And so my guidance counselor saying, Connie, what do you want to do? You're going to go to college. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I don't know. I guess I'll be a social worker, because they help people. And he was so kind to me, Joe Petro. He said, I know you pretty well. You get emotionally invested in people pretty quickly. And I think you're going to burn out of that profession fairly quickly as well. But he looks at my scores. He said, your writing scores are through the roof. Your reading coverage. Have you ever thought about journalism? And I must have looked so surprised, because he said to me, you know, Connie, you're going to be working for a long time. You should love what you do for a living. And nobody had ever told me that. I mean, my dad hated his job at the plant. He always said that. Mom was a nurse's aide. She loved working with patients, but she was mistreated like crazy. They were both working mostly to give us bigger and better lives. And so that was the first time anybody had ever told me that I could love what I do. And it was all I ever wanted to do. Once I went to Kent State and started working for the Daily Kent Stater, I mean, it was my sorority. It was my home away from home. It was my everything to work at the Stater. And it's all I've ever wanted to do until I started very recently writing fiction.
So you didn't write as a child. A lot of authors will say
I did, but no, it never occurred to anybody to tell me that this was, I had my own little, I remember my dad got me one of those little newspaper kits when I was in 5th grade, and I could write and I could print, I could make it. I mean, I loved it. And I was always writing in diaries and journalism, writing short stories in high school. And the teacher I idolized told me I was never going to be a writer when I was at the end of my junior year. So I guess I'm just, one of my dear friends, Bill Libinger, who worked with me for many years at the Plain Dealer, said the best way to get me to do something is to tell me no. So I guess I had the personality for just to be able to, you know, I don't know, fight along when people were telling me things I couldn't. It took me forever to get a column at the Plain Dealer. The editor who finally gave it to me first told me I didn't have it in me to be a columnist. So, you know, I really, the trajectory of my career, as I tell my students, was not this. It was like popcorn in a hot skillet, and it was all over the place, but I was just bopping around and I wasn't going to give up.
So do you have any sort of advice for writers? I don't know if there are any aspiring writers in our audience here, but
there are always aspiring writers in any audience because there are so many who would like to try this. And I would say to you, I'll tell you what got me doing it. I knew that my biggest regret would be that I hadn't tried, that it may not succeed. It may not get the response I was hoping, but I would feel worse if I hadn't tried. And more than anything, it is about discipline. It's getting the seat of the pants into the seat of the chair. And you have to set aside time and you have to make it a habit. It really must become something that you miss if you're not doing it. I'm not somebody who says, oh, I hate writing. I'm glad when it's done. I love writing. I especially love revisions. Writing is hard, sure, but my dad worked at a utility plant electric plant for 36 years. And my mom was a nurse's aide. I don't know hard work compared to them. I always remind myself of that. And I just think at any age, I think about my friend Gailey McCracken, who in her 40s decided she wanted to go to medical school. She was an artist, but she always wanted to be a doctor. And she said, I don't know, Con, if I go to medical school, I'm going to be 50 before I'm a doctor. And I said, what? You're going to be 50 anyway. So why not be 50 and a doctor? And she's been a doctor for many years now. Look, especially I would say this to women of around my age. I gave a TEDx talk a few years ago in 2016, right before the election. That's why I remember it. Oh, what we thought was going to be. But I did this TEDx talk about women over 50 and how my generation of women were really the first generation who didn't expect to become invisible when we turned 50, who didn't expect to be sidelined. And that there are so many, and Gailey was one of the examples I gave. I just know so many women who have embarked on second and third or first careers after their children are grown, there's just so much more out there now, I think, in terms, and if we carry as we climb, we support other women. And especially in the younger women, it doesn't mean we have to step aside, but we need to make room for the younger women and help them grow into leaders and help them get opportunities sooner than certainly my generation did. But I am not by any stretch done yet. My kids tease me all the time because my constant refrain to them is, I'm not 90. I can do this. I can drive here. I can do this. I can take care of this. Don't worry about me. So much, again, is the head game. Who are you going to be at the plate, right?
So we had a question in the chat. What an intuitive and generous guidance counselor. Is there any way that journalism will be a viable career to actually support a family? Sorry, I lost the track. To support a family with papers and even magazines in such decline.
Yes, and here's why I think that. I wouldn't be teaching journalism if I didn't think that if I weren't optimistic about that. First of all, any news source that you're relying on, I hope you'll subscribe if you can afford it. Most of it's going to be digital. It's never been more important. I mean, look at the investigative journalism that's been done in the last 4 years, for example. And when you look at what happened on the Capitol on January 6th, it was the journalism that was informing the public in real time. I mean, that's how I was finding out when I couldn't reach my husband for 40 minutes. I mean, there's just so much out there. The thing is, we have to figure out how to monetize it better. And that more ideas are coming up with private foundations or private funding of it. And reader support really matters a lot. It drives me crazy when I hear somebody angry with something that ran, especially in their local paper. Oh, that's it, they're going to cancel their paper. I every week see things I hate in my local paper, but and it's not just because it's it launched my career. I know a lot of the people who work there. There's always stuff of value in it as well. And during this pandemic, we have really relied on the journalism to, first of all, help us understand it as knowledge was growing about what this virus is and how to prevent it from spreading. We were really dependent on the journalists to tell those stories, and we will continue to be. So I'm more optimistic about it. It was never a great way to make a living. There's no question of that. Can you be a sole provider of a family and be a journalist? Probably not. But most mothers, for example, in this country are women who work outside the home, right? It's just a different world than it was for the Ellies who could stay home at one point. It's a very lucky person who doesn't have to work. And I always, there are always women who will say to me, well, we've made many sacrifices, so I don't have to work. I don't doubt that, but you're still very lucky if your family can survive on one income. So I guess I would start with that. Most families are going to need both people to work. Mm-hmm. And so how do we do it when we're talking about journalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one more question about the book. The reader says, something that resonated with me was the camaraderie amongst women and how those relationships sometimes even usurped those with their partners. Can you talk more about the importance of these relationships and how we should continue to think about these even today?
I love that you got that. I don't know who asked, but thank you. I was just talking to one of my dear friends today, a woman, and saying, we all know people who have not weathered these marriages well during the pandemic. But I have this advice: if they're not hitting you, if they're not, no big decisions should be made right now, because COVID is really hard, and no spouse fills all your needs. It wasn't meant to be that way. And for me, the women, I mean, look, I was a single mom for a decade before I met Sharon. My community of women who were my friends were my family, because nobody lived in the town I was in. And we are still so close. And I have friends I've made since then who are so close. And it's not that I don't have male friends, I do. And I love some of them very much, but we have lifted one another up. We have dropped everything on a moment's notice to be there for one another. And we have lived the lives of their children, and along with our children. And I have two very close friends who have no children, but have all these nieces and nephews. And one's a teacher who has all these children in her life. I mean, that's the thing we have. It's so important to respect women and to meet them where we find them, and to accept them for who they are. I do believe in the sisterhood so strongly. I just wouldn't, there is no way I would be who I am in my career, in my life, without my women friends. There's just not. And I know that grammatically it's accurate to say female friends, but that just makes them sound like specimens in a petri cup. They are my petri dish. They are my friends. Some of them have known me for 3 and 4 decades now, and I love them so much. So of course I was going to write about women's friendships. They saved me. They save a lot of us.
So I assume that would be in your next book as well?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, there will always be women who are friends to other women. And cross-generational, I'm working on the working title right now for this novel is Because You Asked. And at the heart of it is a granddaughter in her early 20s who's going through this stuff. So she's spending it with her grandparents for the summer, but she wants to ask her grandmother about all these different pictures on the wall, because her granddaughter just thinks her grandmother's life's been so full, so rich. And her grandmother finally just says to her, are you under the impression that these pictures tell the whole story of anything? And so the agreement is her daughter, I'm not sure how many can pick a number of pictures, and the grandmother promises to tell the whole story.
Oh.
It comes about, the granddaughter says, oh, come on, there's a picture of you and grandpa, very young, your wedding picture, you fall in love, you get married. And the grandmother just touches her arm and says, not my first choice. And she's stunned to hear this, right? Because she's only known her but of course, this is the truth of our lives. And a photograph never tells I mean, how many of these photos we love, not for how they look, but the whole story that we know was behind it, right? Or what happened after it was a frozen moment in time. So of course there'll be women. There's always women.
Well, that sounds wonderful. I like the idea of telling the story behind the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, sounds great. We have a couple of comments and thank yous in the chats. Someone says that book sounds really great. So we look forward to.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So I don't really have any other questions for you. If there are any more questions in the chat, if there's a couple questions.
Oh, Peggy Stickney, thank you for the comment from Peggy from Elyria. I was born and raised in Erie. Our lives have many, many parallels. I was honored to buy my mom, 87 years old, a copy of your book. We both saw so much of ourselves in our family. I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, I just think we have so much more in common than sometimes we want to admit, right? And certainly across economic boundaries, class boundaries. That's been at the heart of my writing so often in journalism. And I'm really pleased to see women coming from all kinds of backgrounds and finding their place in the book and finding somebody they recognize, often themselves, because to me, that's what fiction's supposed to do. I mean, I tell my students all the time, read fiction, always read fiction, because you learn so much about yourself in the reading of fiction, about how you respond to characters, how you respond to stories, right? It's so much a part of, in my view, daily life. And I'm always pushing novels on him. He reads, I think every senator should be reading a lot of fiction because it helps you dig deeper and you find yourself in these moments and you find your courage often. And I want women to tell their stories. I will go to my grave. She wanted more women to talk about themselves. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Someone's asking if the story is specific to the city of Ashtabula or Andover, and if the former, what is the connection to Andover?
You mean the Daughters of Erietown? Yeah, Andover's in it. It's mentioned, and I will forever be grateful to Andover Public Library because you were talking about research earlier. I needed names that were common in the 30s and 40s, and so they had copies of my parents' yearbooks from their little tiny school in Dorset, Ohio, New Lyme Deming. So they sent them to me, and I have to return them. If anybody's listening from Andover, I promise I am going to return them. But it helped me find names. So Andover was where my great-grandmother, I was very close to my great-grandmother. My mother was raised by her grandmother from age 8. And I really wanted to pursue that line of storyline because it wasn't unusual back then, especially. And now it's not unusual. Again, there are so many grandparents raising grandchildren. Yeah. And there are so many roles women play. I hate the stereotypes. So I just wanted to show women in all these different ways. Aunt Nessa is a well-traveled aunt who never marries, who very deliberately doesn't, because she doesn't want to give up her career, right? Is what she would have had to do back then.
Yes, I do appreciate that you've shown all the different aspects of women's lives, different people who marry, who don't marry, the Rosemary, even the other woman. You really gave a very broad spectrum of women's relationships and what their lives can be. So I have another question here from the chat. What advice would you give to a newish mom who struggles with not wanting to be my mom in both the good ways and the not so good ways and step out of that straddling of two worlds that you mentioned?
Oh, that's a profound conversation, is it not? Because I promise you, as you get older, there is a chance you'll see more about her to admire, but it's very hard, especially when you're a young mother. You're a young mother in a different time, period, than your mother. No matter how old your mother is, you're in a different time. My daughter has a 3-year-old. We have 2 kids with little ones like that, 2 daughters. And motherhood brings it all up for us. It is like a roiling river, and it just churns up all the sentiment that we thought perhaps had settled, because we start wondering. It brings back memories of our own childhood often. It makes us mindful of who we want to be as mothers to our daughters. The big thing here, though, is, Sarah, that you don't want to get lost in all that there's still a you there. And however you choose to mother your child, and however you choose to make your way in this world, Sarah needs to stay intact, and Sarah needs to grow. And the thing is, I'll say it again, if you're never scared, you've stopped growing. And one of the scariest things you can do is declare your independence from how you were raised. People can take it very personally, but ultimately the person you owe the most to is yourself. So that is a challenging endeavor, but boy, it is a life's work. And there is nothing more important, in my view, for you to discover who you are. I hope that answers your question. I mean, that's something that really we would sit and talk about for 2 hours over coffee, and then more coffee, and how that goes.
That was great advice. So thank you, Connie, for spending the last hour with us. I very much appreciate, she's inviting you to coffee.
Well, thank you everyone for showing up tonight what is tonight? Tuesday night? Yeah,
Tuesday night. Yeah.
I lose track of the days so often. I'm so grateful to everybody for being here tonight.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to you, to our viewers, to the foundation who sponsored tonight's program. And especially you, Connie, for the time that you've given us very generously. Thank you.
Well, Carla, I do want to say one more thing. You put so much effort into this, and I am so grateful for you tonight. I mean, you didn't just read the book, you really read it. And I'm really impressed with the questions you asked. And I know all the preparation that went into this. So thank you to you, all right? And to Euclid Public Library. It means a lot to me.
Thank you. We're so glad to have you here. So if there aren't any other questions, we're getting thank yous in the comments. Again, we'll look forward to your next book. And if any of you have not read the book yet, I can wholeheartedly recommend it. And you can pick it up at the library or at a bookstore. And the paperback is coming out in June.
June, yeah.
So you can get the paperback as well. So,
all right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.